So what I've asked each of them to do is first say a few words, a few minutes worth of a takeaway from the past 2 days, what really sticks in their minds. And happily, Marcia had to cover events down on the Hill for much of the past 2 days. Wasn't the original intention, but Congress doesn't always. They try. They don't always schedule their hearings and meetings coordinated with the Goddard Symposium, and this time they didn't succeed. So, as I said, fortunately, so Marcia will be able to give us, I think, some highlights from her experience for the past days. Let's start with Frank. So again, highlights, and then I have some guiding questions. We'll certainly want questions from you all. So Frank. Sorry.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Harley. And I see Marcia has a whole big page of notes. These are mine, and they're not very coherent or in order or anything, but I've deliberately stayed here through all the sessions, and I'm counting on Marcia to tell me what I missed. One of the things I wanted to start out with was what Bob Rogers said yesterday. I had never heard that presentation, but I am kind of beginning in the last presidential administration, I became kind of interested in Roman history. And I was looking for parallels, but he really laid it out. The idea of the dare taker, the caretaker, and the undertaker. My wife says that's corny, but I found it a really good way to sort of describe the trajectory of the Roman Empire, for example. And also to kind of understand what's been happening at NASA. I've covered NASA pretty much continuously since 1991, and I grew up in it. My father worked for NASA, so I'm a NASA brat. And it's been a very interesting 6 or 7 years, to say the least. And I think that pattern, that matrix that he gave us is a good way to think about it. And so that's point one. Point two is that I'm coming away from these 2 days very encouraged by what I've heard. The example that he gave of the Walt Disney Company was fascinating to me. I don't know that much about the Walt Disney Company, but the idea that it had a second life, a second spurt when they got a new CEO. And maybe, just maybe, that's where we are today and in the space business, the space industry. And it's where, after going through a period of uncertainty, I just wanted to, one of the things that I was struck by was the idea of the dare taker, the guy with the big idea. I sneak off to, I've discovered Logan, Utah at the SmallSat conference as a nice place to go in August if anyone is looking for a way to get away from the DC heat. And to get kind of a breath of fresh air from the people who participate. They're very young and they're doing really interesting things really fast. It's CubeSats and it's amazing how fast it's going. And we're starting to see it. We certainly heard a lot about it today. I'm writing about it a lot more than I used to, even without my junket to the Cache Valley of Utah. And these people will, they have the luxury of being able to try anything because they're young and it doesn't cost much. And I've seen a lot of that here the past couple of days, and not necessarily from young people and not necessarily about stuff that doesn't cost much. And I was talking to Frank Ceppolini about the audacity of science and some of the things that the scientists are doing. The astronomy lecture that we just heard, fantastic. Jim Green's briefing yesterday on the 2 missions. My wife is a former college professor. If he hasn't been one, he's certainly got a future in it if this NASA thing doesn't work out. I really learned a lot about just what science can try, can attempt to do. I had to stretch my brain a little bit, and I should tell you I'm a comparative literature major, so I can manage the checkbook, and that's about it in the numbers department. But tonight, about 11:30, I think they're launching the MMS mission. And that is a fantastic, it's an attempt to really push the envelope in science. And it's an amazing engineering feat. And, you know, I really hope it works because it shows that, you know, how science will dare something. It's also very expensive. It's not a cheap mission. And the science may be a little obscure. Magnetic reconnection is a concept that I'm still not sure I understand, but sounds really interesting and important. And certainly the astronomy and the cosmology understanding that the objectives that we heard today are important and fascinating. One of the things that I'm coming away from this with is, I don't know if for those of you who were here yesterday for the industry technology lecture, there was, you know, they had the little desktop 3D printer, and then they had what he called the enterprise level 3D printer, and there's really nothing in the middle. And that seems to be where space generically is right now. I mean, you've got CubeSats and you've got these big missions, and you know, maybe it's starting to work in that direction. And I think I'm going to stop talking here in a minute. One of the things that, of course, everyone knows that's been going on and that has been a source of discomfort and copy for me over the past 6 or 7 years has been the shift to commercial and the commercial approach versus big government, you know, and it gets very political and libertarian and I don't know what all, but you know, a couple of the guys who were just sitting here have customers who are not the government, and they are trying really audacious things. One, human spaceflight, which is pretty audacious, and the other is, you know, mining in space. And there are other people like that who are, you know, looking for another way to make money in space besides communications relays, which so far, as I can tell, is the only pot of gold that's been found up there. I happen to know where Jeff is right now. There's a briefing that actually I can say this now because the embargo is lifted. But Lockheed Martin is proposing a commercial space tug. They don't like to call it that. That's what it is for the next round of space station cargo. But it's extensible to deep space. It's to go to cislunar space to support lunar bases eventually. And you know, they're a company. They're traditionally dealt with the big government contracts, and it's a big idea, and they talk big and everything else. But it shows that the traditional space companies are moving in that direction, as they must if they want to survive, really. So it's maybe the difference between Eastman Kodak and the Disney company. That's very disjointed. I'm just looking to see if I have anything else I wanted to say. I did like to hear Charlie Bolden say that he thinks that China will eventually be brought into the family of spacefaring nations. It's one of the groups that isn't here right now. I don't recognize anybody from Congress, Marcia may, but I don't think anybody from Congress has been here the past couple of days, either members or staff. And of course, they're the ones who are the big customer for space still, and not just in this country, but you know, in the world. And they have a lot different motivations than I think the people in this room do. And it becomes a communications problem. I write for a trade publication with a very specialized audience, and you know, I'm not USA Today. I can't really, my stories don't go much beyond the choir. I preach to the choir. I hope I don't preach, but my audience is pretty much already convinced that what they do is important, and I write about you. So this has been like I say, this has been a very encouraging time. I think I'm beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel for some of the things that have kind of bothered me over the past few years. So I think I'll stop there.
Good. Marcia?
So I unfortunately have missed almost all of this meeting because there have been so many things going on the past 2 days. This morning there was a hearing before Senator Cruz, who now chairs the Space Subcommittee in the Senate, and Harley asked that I just fill you in a little bit for those of you who weren't following me on Twitter or following Jeff Faust or all the other space folks who were tweeting about the hearing. It was the first hearing that Senator Cruz had with someone from the administration, and of course he has strong points of view about the Obama administration, which are not all that positive. And so I think there was an expectation it was going to be very confrontational, but it wasn't. It was actually fairly polite and cordial, and it underscored the difference in opinions basically about whether or not Earth science should be one of NASA's core priorities. Senator Cruz has said in a number of venues already that he wants to use his chairmanship of the subcommittee to refocus NASA on its core priorities. And what he made clear today was that his core priority is exploration, and he includes in exploration just about everything that NASA does except Earth science. He is well known as a climate change skeptic, but he really did not couch his arguments in those terms. It was an argument that I think we've all heard before, which is that what NASA does uniquely is human spaceflight and planetary science and those kinds of activities, whereas Earth science is done by many federal agencies, and he doesn't see why NASA should be devoting its scarce resources to Earth science instead of these other areas that are really unique to NASA. There were 4 senators there, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and it was clear that this was a partisan issue. And by and large, it still was cordial nonetheless. There were a little bit of biting in there, but not too much. And I thought that Charlie Bolden really did a very good job of holding his own in these arguments. Basically, he was pointing out that although a lot of people don't see why NASA's involved in Earth science, they are the ones actually providing the data from the satellites that enable other kinds of scientists to do their work. And this really came out in a whole discussion about the SMAP satellites, soil moisture active passive, that's doing soil moisture readings, and Charlie was bringing it up in Texas because of course Cruz is from Texas, and Charlie lived in Texas all those years. He was an astronaut, and talking about Texas now, you really need to know about soil moisture because of the droughts and everything. And that's one of the reasons Earth science satellites are good for Texas as well as for everybody else. And the whole conversation sort of evolved over the course of the hearing, and Senator Gardner was there from Colorado, who's a Republican and was agreeing with Cruz, and he finally said, "I think NASA should be more about the heavens than about dirt in Texas." Which is really, it's kind of a funny line, but you know, Charlie kept his equanimity, and he came back and said, you know, that NASA doesn't do soil moisture studies in Texas. It provides the data for the people who do soil moisture studies in Texas. And I thought that that was a pretty good comeback. So it was a short hearing. It was only an hour. They got started a little late. They ended about 11:15, I guess it was. And I'm not sure very much came out of it except putting on the public record this disagreement, mostly on a partisan basis between Republicans and Democrats, as to the priority status that Earth science should have at NASA. Senator Cruz did put up a chart that tracked, and I'm not quite sure if it was the president's budget request for or appropriations for Earth science versus other parts of NASA since President Obama took office. So it was, you know, this was one end of the spectrum, was 2009 up until today. And according to his calculations, Earth science has gone up 41% over that period of time, while exploration has gone down 7.4%. And Charlie was making clear that he did not necessarily agree with the numbers on the chart because it wasn't clear how all things had been counted and whether or not in exploration they were including things like the Kennedy Space Center and other ground-based infrastructure that you need for the human spaceflight program to work. But Senator Cruz has now put out a press release that includes that chart, so if you're interested in seeing the way he was counting the dollars, you can take a look at that. But Senator Peters, who as of yesterday is the new ranking member on the subcommittee, the top Democrat on the subcommittee, came back, and I saw Michael Maloney here earlier. I don't know if he's still here, but he quoted the National Research Council's 2012 midterm assessment of the Earth Science Decadal Survey that talked about how the Bush-era cuts to Earth science were disastrous. And so if you looked at a different period of time, not just from when Obama came into office until today, but you look back to the Clinton administration, you would see that Earth science funding was actually just getting back up to the level that it had been during the Clinton administration. So if you looked at a different time scale, you would get a very different answer. So that's basically how the hearing went. David Newman, who is the president's nominee to be deputy administrator of NASA, was there sitting in the front row behind Charlie Bolden. And Charlie and Bill Nelson did use the opportunity to encourage the committee to move forward with her nomination, but there was no big announcement at the hearing as to whether or not they were going to schedule a nomination hearing for her or not, but she was there. So that's all I'll say about the hearing. In terms of this conference, I am awfully sorry I missed it because I've heard wonderful things about it when I got back this afternoon. And I think what struck me most about it was Bob Rogers' presentation that Frank has already talked about, and I'm still chewing it over in my mind. And I've been in this business a very long time, and part of me thinks, you know, gosh, I've heard these really eloquent arguments in favor of space exploration many, many times, and they never seem to make any difference. And as much as I enjoyed his presentation, it really was talking to the choir. It was talking to all of us about how we should unite together behind a bold leader and, you know, do the dare taker step again, the way Michael Eisner did after Walt Disney's death and what happened to the Disney company. You know, and you know, I've been thinking about that a lot these past 2 days. To begin with, despite the wonderful panel that we just had on commercial space, the space program still pretty much is government. And there is no single leader in government. That's not the way the United States works. There's the executive branch and there's the legislative branch. And more these days, if you're going to do a big space program, you have international partners and you have commercial partners. So you can't rely on having a single bold leader to move you forward in most of the things that I think that he was trying to get at in his presentation. People talk about the space program and how we need to make sure the space program doesn't fall on hard times. But if you look into that a little bit, usually what they really mean is the human spaceflight program. They don't mean the space science, you know, and everything else, space technology even. What they mean is the human spaceflight program. And so you look at this chart, and I loved the fork in the road. That was just a wonderful visual image. And so you see it's standing there, and you have a curve going up and a curve going down. And I keep asking myself, so the space program, there really is not just a single space program. There's the government space program, there's the commercial space program, there's international partners. And I think that one of the conference is about what's next, and I think what's next may be trying to get all of us to think more in terms of the space program being more than just NASA. It has been more than just NASA forever, but people still think of NASA when they think of the space program. And in that context, I'm not sure what to take away from his chart as to whether or not NASA has gone through the dare taker, caretaker status and now is in a fork on the road to go to undertaker, or if he means the space program writ large, because it may be a different answer for different segments of the space program. You know, what's going to happen in low Earth orbit after the space station stops? You know, Bill Gerstenmaier has been making it clear that he does not foresee the U.S. government building another low Earth orbit space station. He's looking to the commercial sector to do something. So I haven't seen, Bigelow was out there today talking about his module, but I haven't seen companies stepping up to buy his modules and use it for anything. Space station, whether it's 2024 or 2028, it's only a few more years it's going to be up there. So is someone going to make a decision in the commercial sector that there is a need for LEO infrastructure and they're going to step up and build that infrastructure? Or is the United States, government and commercial, just going to decide we don't need low Earth orbit infrastructure anymore? I think that there is a fork in the road here, but I'm not sure it's as simple to think of it as just NASA. And even if you did just think of it as just NASA, it's not simple because government programs don't have a single leader. At a minimum, they have a president and they have a Congress, and oftentimes it's much more complex than that. So that's all I have to say.
Great. So start thinking of questions. I've got one, although I'm curious, in the Senate hearing, did any one of the senators bring in a snowball?
No. No.
Oh, okay. Well, Okay, so I've got one question which is intended for the next several minutes. Fringe slide is.
So you just need to double check on the zip file.
The two of you do, in some sense, mediate between the practitioners of human spaceflight, commercial science, and so on, and the public. Which are, in turn, first you, Marcia, and then Frank. Which are the topics that generate the response you get, either in response to the, directly or over cocktails, whatever? Which are the topics that generate most interest, positive or negative? Which ones?
So there's a comment function on my website, and I don't get a whole lot of comments, and I think it's because I have the filter set really high, because I only allow polite discourse, and so if there are certain words in it, it automatically blocks it. And also if people put hyperlinks in their answer, it blocks it, because I'm not going to be responsible for what other people post on their websites. But I will tell you, at one point, it's tedious to have to go in and look at each one of these manually. So for a while, I had it set so that anything could be posted, and I would look at it afterwards, and I could take it down if I didn't think it was polite. But when I published the article about Senator Cruz becoming chairman of the subcommittee, I got the most awful comments. I can't believe that people write this stuff, really. And I understand it's been going on for years, ever since Twitter and social media came along, that people post these things anonymously. But they were just saying the most terrible things, not just against Senator Cruz, but also against the people who were against Senator Cruz. And I finally just said, I'm taking your comments down. If you want to rephrase it politely, I'll reconsider. So Senator Cruz certainly brought up a lot of comments recently, and the other one was that last week Charlie Bolden testified to the House Appropriations Committee, and I wrote up a story all about what he said and everything, and I said, no, by the way, Congressman Culberson wants interstellar propulsion, which the congressman did say, and now I'm getting all these comments about interstellar propulsion and people with their ideas of what their interstellar propulsion will look like and everything, so that's what seems to pique people's interest.
Hey, Frank?
We have this this big flat screen in our newsroom that's hooked up to some kind of counter on how many people are reading each story, and it's displayed by the size of the square and then the title of the story. And Marcia wrote a story for us. She blogs for us occasionally about the asteroid redirect mission. And it seemed like for 2 or 3 days, every time I walked into the newsroom, it was still asteroid redirect mission was the big square on that screen. It's generically that's a new idea that's very controversial. People have ideas on both sides of it, just like I guess they do about Senator Cruz. And lately, I'm just trying to think back where I've gotten. We have a comment section on our website, which is probably the best way to gauge, aside from just actual eyeballs on a story. And I've gotten a lot of comment lately about the Dawn mission to Ceres. People are fascinated with that, and some on human spaceflight. EFT1 got a lot of comment. People who comment want to talk about, as Marcia said, their ideas about things, and so anything that's sort of cutting edge and open to discussion, not a news story, but something that's kind of cast forward. And because of who our readers are, we really write for the aerospace industry. We're Aviation Week in space technology, so we also have defense and commercial airlines and but the space people who read my stuff, they like to talk about how what are we going to find at Pluto? What are those bright spots on Ceres? What's a better way? What's a good way to do something kind of techy?
And I'll just add, because Frank reminded me, so another story I got a lot of comments on was an MIT analysis of the feasibility of the Mars One program. And what happens, and it was actually kind of interesting, and those people were much more polite, by the way, but they did get into their ideas of how to do this, that, or what was feasible, and they're talking to each other. They long since have lost track of whatever I wrote in my article. And that's happened on the comments on the asteroid redirect one that I wrote for Av Week. they're all arguing with each other, and I'm looking at these comments and I'm saying, but I never said that. But if you follow it back, you know, they're actually commenting on what some other commenter said. So I think it's a great way to stimulate dialogue, and as long as people stay polite, it's fine with me.
Question, let's take a few questions from the audience. Folks. Yeah, Frank.
Question for Marcia, although Frank may have some perspectives he wants to share. I guess what I'm thinking to my mind, and this is a somewhat of an oversimplification, but you'll see where I'm going with this. If you look at the human space exploration program, predominantly the work is done at NASA facilities that are in, shall we say, red states. Science missions, especially earth science missions, are predominantly done in places that, like Maryland, are blue states. California is another one that comes to mind with JPL, Ames. Do we run the risk of having NASA become, going by what Senator Cruz said today and some other things that have happened, of NASA becoming not as bipartisan in the future, where there'll be a blue NASA and a red NASA, not inside the agency, but in terms of its congressional support on the Hill? And does the administration risk exacerbating that by concentrating all the earth science work that previously was in NOAA inside of NASA?
Well, I think that NASA is still largely bipartisan as long as you don't get into budget numbers. That really is where the rubber meets the road. And when you had these strong conflicts, I think it was 2 years ago when the sequestration was in effect and the Republicans were hard over on their numbers and the Democrats were hard over on their numbers, that's really where you saw the partisan splits. And when you lifted that for fiscal 14 and 15, then suddenly everybody was getting along together. So I do think that a lot of it comes down to resource allocations and how hard the Republicans want to fight on deficit reduction, and if they want to keep the sequester or replace it with something that may not be any better for domestic discretionary agencies. So I think I'm really not worried about it splitting into a red NASA and a blue NASA. I think that support for NASA, generally speaking, is pretty broad across the Hill. The question really isn't, you know, do you support the space program? Everybody I know supports the space program. Where you get in trouble is when you start prioritizing it against other national objectives. And I don't see it as largely political, and I think the one exception is earth science.
I do have a comment, and that is that I have seen an increasing use of the space issue as a partisan football. And I know I have a point at which I said this is a bad thing, and it was when Sean O'Keefe went to Alabama and campaigned for a Republican candidate for governor. I'd never seen a NASA administrator do anything like that before, and I think that kind of opened the door to the sort of partisan back and forth that we see, particularly in the House Science Committee is where I see it. Maybe some in the, well, I think that's probably where it's most obvious for me. And, you know, like Marcia said, I think people do support space. Nobody wants to be the one to turn off the lights at NASA or anywhere else, or ground the space station or do any of that sort of thing. But I think there's a danger then that the issues that we've talked about here the past couple of days get lost in the he said, she said, who's got one up, who's right, who's wrong, sort of day-to-day political scrummage.
And I do think there is a lot of partisanship on, for example, the Science Committee. I don't think it has touched space nearly as much as it's touched the other areas under the committee's jurisdiction, like EPA and those kinds of issues. And so when you compare the exchanges in the Space Subcommittee with those in some of the other subcommittees, it's really a very pleasant exchange by comparison.
Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Lee, work at Goddard. Taking off from that, one of the odd things that's happened with human spaceflight is that you have these activities taking place predominantly in democratic states that are on an ideological model that you would think would come from the Republicans, which is farming things out to private industry and promoting the development of new technologies and new industries. And what you might think ideologically would be more of a left-leaning thing of having a government-run program is mostly taking place from red states. And there's been a lot of comment on this from the new space community of how the heck did we get here? And so I was wondering if you have any insights into that?
Well, I think that when Commercial Crew came along, it was it wasn't red state, blue state. As I recall it, Dan Rohrabacher was fully behind it, and nobody else was. And he himself commented that he didn't understand why his Republican colleagues were not jumping on the bandwagon. And I think that what you were seeing there was, a conflict, between maybe where your political tendencies might take you and where your national tendencies would take you, where you want national leadership in space and you want the United States to be the leader in space, and so you want to make sure that your premier space agency, NASA, is building the rockets and building the spacecraft. And I do think there was, and there still is, some skepticism about the business models for these companies. So, things are going pretty well on commercial cargo right now. Orbital is finding a way back from its failure, and it doesn't seem to be costing the government too much money, extra money. And so I think people are feeling a little more comfortable with commercial cargo. I think with Commercial Crew, it is moving forward, but there still is this question as to whether or not the government needs to support two companies instead of just one. And Congresswoman Edwards made a very interesting statement 2 weeks ago at a hearing on Commercial Crew that she thinks that this word commercial is confusing a lot of people, because the members who aren't knowledgeable about space, they hear Commercial Crew, so they think that companies are paying for this. And then NASA's coming and asking for $1.244 billion, and these people who aren't on the space committees or whatever saying, well, what do you mean? I thought it was commercial. Why aren't the companies paying for this? Why are you asking me to put taxpayers' dollars down on this? So I think that there's still a lot of confusion about what commercial is and how commercial is in some of these areas that I think, it adds to the whole complexity of these debates.
Last question.
Okay. I'm going to follow up on this fascinating red state, blue state. And it goes to the idea of where the public is on that. I would posit that the public is very generally supportive of human space exploration, but they do want the balance. They want the space applications and the science, especially the earth science. And I got to think that 10, 20 years from now, where do you think the public's going to be? Are they going to want to have less of what the earth science mission is? And this is my dissertation subject, the history of the NASA Earth Science mission. I think they're going to want to study the hell out of it if there are more indications of sea level rise and drought and what's going on in the Antarctic ice shelves in Greenland. So I think that, in a way, that's a genuine threat to the exploration mission if you try to subvert the whole of the NASA activity.
So I'm sure you're all going to beat me up at the reception for saying this, but I think the public has very little idea what NASA does. And just as I think that very few people know that we have people up on a space station, I bet you nobody knows that NASA does earth science. I think the scientists who use satellite data don't know it comes from NASA. And I've known a lot of earth scientists when I was working at the Space Studies Board, and they get data. They don't look at where it came from. Whether it came from a buoy or it came from an ocean altimetry satellite, that's not their issue. They just want, what is the data? They're not looking at the source. So I think that there's very little awareness outside of the very inner circle of the NASA community that NASA even has an earth science program.
Frank, you have the option of the last words. I guess not.
Well, actually, I do have something. I'm just trying to think how to say it in a nice way. The red states haven't always been red, and the blue states haven't always been blue. There's always been an element of port barrel politics in the space program right from the get-go. I'm from Alabama. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama. Used to be a blue state, and that had a lot to do with the Tennessee Valley Authority. I mean, the political spectrum shifts back and forth over time. I think this issue of where stuff is getting done right now is very interesting. I think that a lot of the really commercial, what we call commercial space stuff, is getting done in blue states because it spins out of some of the other stuff that was already being done there, like Silicon Valley and the computers. That the applications that came out of there which I think came out of the big government space programs of the 60s. And, you know, I think a lot of our international partners understand that better than we do today, that we don't just go to space to explore and all that, but also for the word inspiration has been used a lot here. It's to get people interested in the kinds of things that make a country economically competitive. That's what they know in Bangalore, that's what they know in Beijing, and now in Johannesburg, a lot of places all over Europe. I don't pay that much attention to red state, blue state. It's more who's doing what, where's the money going, where are the jobs. I would be driving a tractor right now. That's true. If the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee hadn't relocated the Von Braun rocket team in Madison County as a consolation prize because the Alabama senators didn't get the wind tunnel that's now in Tullahoma, Tennessee. That's sort of the level of space politics, ultimately, I think, on Capitol Hill.
Great. Let's